I was recently at a tech conference in Zurich, sharing a drink with a high-level compliance officer for a global logistics firm. He was remarkably polished, speaking with a kind of clinical calm about risk mitigation and global stability. He spent a good 20 minutes explaining how his company was spearheading humanitarian efforts in conflict zones, and he sounded, more like a high-ranking diplomat than a corporate executive. He seemed genuinely convinced that his work and the luxury beliefs of his managerial peers was the new vanguard of human progress. Then I asked him a simple question. What happens when your interests conflict with the local government's laws? He didn't skip a beat. He didn't talk about courts and international treaties or the social contract. Instead, he leaned in and showed me a live feed on his tablet, a crisp, high-definition satellite view of a private port halfway across the world, patrolled by autonomous drones that didn't belong to any national military. And he said, "We don't really deal with local laws in the way you mean." His voice dropped to this detached, matter-of-fact whisper. He said, "We provide the electricity, the internet, and the security. If the state disappears tomorrow, our clients won't even notice the lights flicker." That casual admission that a corporation had effectively replaced the state's monopoly on force with its own security as a service, it was chilling. It wasn't just a business strategy. It was a total displacement of sovereignty. It made me realize that while we are busy debating constitutional tweaks or minor political policy, the real kinetic power has already migrated to a new class of non-elected lords. We aren't witnessing a political disagreement. We are witnessing the return of the East India Company, except this time, the company owns the satellites, the algorithms, and the very definitions of truth we use to complain about them. Okay, so let's unpack this. Our deep dive today is into that quiet, structural displacement of democratic sovereignty, the shift away from the state's monopoly on legitimate force toward a system of, private kinetic hegemony and neo-feudal control wielded by a new, non-elected corporate and managerial elite. We are tracing this radical change. What happens when the very definition of political authority moves out of the hands of government and, into the cloud?
And that's the perfect way to frame it. To understand that displacement, we absolutely have to start at the beginning with the creation of the nation-state itself.
Right.
Because what is actively eroding isn't just a political system, but the fundamental historical architecture of the modern state. That structure, for centuries, was built on the premise of war, coercion, and an internationally recognized, if contested, monopoly on violence within defined territorial borders.
The monopoly on violence, that's the key.
It's everything. The moment you lose control of that monopoly, you lose sovereignty itself.
And when we talk about the origin of the state, we cannot ignore Charles Tilly, the historian who famously described the state as being, little more than organized crime, a kind of protection racket.
Yes.
Tilly's view is far grittier than the neat philosophical concepts of the social contract. So what was Tilly's central argument about the origins of the European state?
Tilly's claim, which spanned 1,000 years of history from about AD 990 to 1992, was foundational and really functionalist. The origins of the modern European state lay entirely in war and preparations for war.
Not philosophy, not rights, just war.
Exactly. It's a mechanism driven by brute necessity, not enlightened self-interest or some grand social compact.
So how did mere fighting force the creation of something as complex as a government?
The mechanism is elegant in its brutality. You see, early conflicts were often manageable with, say, feudal levies and local resources. But military innovation fundamentally changed the equation.
You're talking about gunpowder.
Gunpowder, artillery, and later, the necessity of fielding large, professional, standing armies, the things needed to fight something like the 30 Years' War, for example, made conflict prohibitively expensive. Rulers were suddenly locked in this relentless existential arms race. And in that race, survival depended on securing vast amounts of money and manpower, what Dale Kelch is called coercion and capital.
So if you wanted to survive against your rivals, you couldn't just rely on your local lords anymore. You had to figure out how to pay cash and mobilize bodies, and fast.
Precisely. This absolute necessity for funding and security drove the creation of extensive, standardized, extractive structures. You needed systematic, legible taxation. You needed conscription mechanisms that could track, train, and supply large populations of soldiers.
You need a bureaucracy.
You need a huge bureaucracy. This, in turn, demanded the creation of state bureaucracies, centralized treasuries, tax collection agencies, and elaborate logistics systems on a scale that had never been seen before. The entire machinery of the modern state, its administrative capacity, its record-keeping, its civil service, was essentially an expensive side effect of the desperate need to win the next war.
So the state is an accidental byproduct of an arms race.
That's a great way to put it. Tilly summarized it perfectly. War wove the European network of national states, and preparation for war created the internal structures of states within it. It was not a deliberate, benevolent attempt to build a centralized state. It was a desperate, self-interested attempt by rulers to mobilize resources for military dominance.
This analysis gives a much stronger context than the idea that governments were just formed to protect property rights. They were formed to wage war, and everything else just sort of followed.
Right.
But this leads to a fascinating and kind of counterintuitive observation, the central paradox, Tilly noted. The military pursuit that created the national state eventually led to the civilianization of government and domestic politics. How did a machine built for slaughter end up being run by, civil servants in suits?
It was a gradual, unintended consequence, and it stemmed from the fact that money is fundamentally harder to mobilize than violence. Tilly detailed 4 distinct incremental reasons for this transfer of power to civilian entities.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, the sheer scale of the extractive structures required to maintain a massive standing military had to be managed. The tax offices, the treasuries, the supply chains, the debt management systems, these were run by civilians. This huge bureaucratic apparatus, simply by virtue of its operational necessity and size, naturally formed a powerful administrative counterweight to the armed forces. I mean, the man who could audit the books suddenly held considerable power over the general who needed the funds.
So the administrative arm, the people who understood the balance sheet, gained leverage over the kinetic arm.
Exactly. Second, rulers couldn't just take the necessary resources, they had to bargain for them. They had to negotiate with established civilian entities like urban merchant leagues, powerful landowners, and nascent parliamentary bodies to secure the loans and the tax assent needed for long conflicts.
And that bargaining process gives those civilian groups real power.
It legitimizes their input. It effectively legitimizes civilian input into governance, slowly transferring political power away from the military court and toward bodies representing capital and administration.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the third reason?
Third, and this is crucial, the capacity of the state dramatically expanded during wartime to track citizens, to manage supply chains, to collect revenue efficiently, and critically, once the war ended, that capacity did not fully downsize.
The classic state ratchet effect.
That's it. The wartime bureaucracy, once created, found new peacetime mandates, whether it was maintaining roads, regulating trade, or providing basic public services. The capacity remained, and it needed management, which was civilian work.
And the fourth?
Fourth, the reliance on debt. Prolonged warfare required massive public debt, forcing the creation of sophisticated, permanent civilian bureaucracies dedicated solely to servicing those state debts. These debt managers and financiers encouraged, and sometimes demanded, deep state intervention in the local economy just to ensure stable revenue streams could cover the interest payments.
So central banks.
Think of the birth of central banks and specialized treasury departments. They were born out of wartime necessity to manage financial liabilities. So, while the nature of the state remained ultimately coercive, the individuals wielding the power domestically became administrators and financiers, not soldiers.
That structural framework, the centralized state built for war and financed by civilian bureaucracy, is what established the Westphalian order, the system we are now watching crumble. So what exactly did Westphalian sovereignty, which was conceptually established around 1648, give us?
Westphalia gave us the operating system of the modern world for over 3 centuries. The idea that the world is neatly divided into nation-states. These states are recognized as sovereign within their borders, meaning no outside power has the right to interfere internally, and they equal internationally, at least in a legal sense.
The king is emperor in his kingdom.
Exactly. Rex Imperator and Suo Regno. It sets up these neatly distinct territorial spheres of authority.
We take that so for granted today, but what kind of chaotic structure did Westphalia replace? You mentioned this bowl of spaghetti of authority before.
The complexity of medieval authority before 1648 is, it's hard to overstate. Imagine a system where the lines of loyalty, taxation, and law were completely opaque and overlapping. The authority structure of the post-Roman and medieval world was a mess, and the Reformation only increased the pressure points.
Okay, so what were the main sources of that mess?
There were 2 major sources of this porous authority. The first was the pervasive supranational authority of the Catholic Church. We often forget that the church wasn't just a religious body, it was a massive political and economic superpower.
It was a true sovereign entity competing with kings.
Absolutely. The church was the largest single landowner across much of Europe. Bishops and abbots frequently held temporal, feudal authority over vast territories, serving as political lords who answered both to the Pope in Rome and their local king.
So a big chunk of a king's land wasn't really his.
In practice, no. It was governed by an entity whose ultimate allegiance lay elsewhere. Furthermore, the church regulated vital aspects of secular life, like marriage, education, and social welfare, and possessed its own internal legal system, canon law, that often superseded local civil law.
And most critically, the church held the power to intervene in matters of violence and peace.
Precisely. They regulated religious policy and violence. Think of the power of excommunication, or the ability to call for or condemn wars. The Pope's ability to intervene, say, in the religious policy of France, or the appointment of bishops in England, represented a massive intrusion into what we would now call internal affairs. The Church's constant involvement in regulating which forms of religious violence were legitimate was a direct challenge to a secular ruler's claimed monopoly on force.
Okay, so that's the church. What was the other major source of confusion?
The second area of messiness was the complexity of composite monarchies, and the best example is the vast network known as the Holy Roman Empire. The HRE wasn't a state, it was a layered political entity. You had hundreds of principalities, free cities, bishoprics, and minor noble lands, all existing under the nominal authority of an elected emperor.
So even a powerful local duke didn't have full sovereignty over his own territory?
Not at all. Princes within the HRE often pursued international policies completely outside or even actively against the emperor's grand strategy. A local prince might ally with France against the emperor, or impose a religious policy that completely contradicted the emperor's wishes.
Total fragmentation.
Complete fragmentation. There was no singular recognized locus of authority. Westphalia, therefore, was an attempt to simplify this system, to draw clear lines on the map and state. Within this line, there is one recognized sovereign, and that sovereign is the only legitimate source of law and coercion. This idea of internally self-contained sovereignty is what created the environment for the civilianized, bureaucratic state to flourish.
That historical setup is critical. The state was created to centralize violence and taxation, and it was defined by its ability to draw clear boundaries around its authority. So let's transition from the rise of that state to the hijacking of that state capacity by a new, non-elected power structure.
This is where we shift from the realm of physical coercion to the realm of bureaucratic control. And the key thinker here is James Burnham, whose 1941 thesis argued that Western society was undergoing a profound structural change.
Burnham, writing during the Great Depression, argued that capitalism was not moving toward the socialism that Marx had predicted. What was his alternative vision?
He posited that society was moving toward a new, non-socialist managerial society. Burnham's central insight was that the capitalist class, the traditional owners who held the title deeds to the means of production, was becoming functionally obsolete. They retained ownership on paper, but they no longer possessed the necessary operational knowledge to run modern, large-scale industrial systems.
So who took their place?
The managerial class. And Burnham defined them not merely as middle management, but as those engaged in the technical direction and coordination of the process of production. This group is wide-ranging. Operating executives, superintendents, administrative engineers, supervisory technicians in industry, and crucially, government administrators, bureau heads, and commissioners in the civil service.
The people who actually know how stuff works.
The technocrats, yes. Their power grew because modern industry and government became so complex and specialized that no single capitalist owner could possess the necessary hyper-specific technical knowledge in chemistry, logistics, engineering, or finance. Power shifted from those who owned the paper to those who possessed the necessary expertise to keep the system running.
This sounds less like a revolution and more like a quiet coup by the hyper-educated and administratively savvy.
It was absolutely a quiet revolution. Burnham predicted this class would eventually seize control of the means of production from the capitalist owners, making the paper ownership irrelevant. And he warned that this managerial class consolidates its power through a specific political mechanism: the unlimited state.
The unlimited state, meaning they use the machinery of government, which Tilly showed was already centralized, as their vehicle to gain power.
Exactly. This new class replaces traditional limited government based on fixed constitutional law with governance based on fluid, executive, and regulatory administrative decree. The traditional concept of law passed by elected representatives and applying equally is supplanted by the specialized, voluminous, and often unintelligible regulation drafted by non-elected agency staff.
That brings us right to the modern critique of the structure, the managerial state as an ongoing regime. It doesn't matter who you vote for, this administrative class remains in power, using these abstract, expansive goals like equality or positive rights to justify their perpetual expansion and maintenance of their position.
And this is where the transition from traditional shareholder capitalism to this managerial neo-feudalism becomes structural. The modern managerial class doesn't just run factories, they run the rule book. They create and enforce rules that require specialized knowledge just to comply with, erecting what are effectively regulatory moats.
That concept of soft enclosure is really powerful.
Yeah.
So how does administrative law function as a barrier to entry, transforming citizens into, mere tenants?
Let's look at the example of Julian, the independent contractor. Julian's family business was a mid-sized electrical firm in a European city, and it had been thriving for 3 generations on craftsmanship and, clear, stable local commercial statutes. If the law said wire gauge A is required, Julian used it. The rules are predictable.
Simple enough.
But over the past decade, however, the world changed around him. Julian found himself buried under a mountain of administrative compliance that didn't originate from the local parliament. Instead, new layers of technocratic oversight, often drafted by global consulting firms and enforced by unaccountable agencies, began to redefine his entire industry.
And these weren't simple laws.
No, they were dense, shifting frameworks governing everything from emissions reporting and supply chain transparency to mandatory internal audit procedures and diversity metrics.
The overhead for just navigating those frameworks must have been staggering for a small firm.
It was crippling. Julian could manage the physical electrical work, but he couldn't afford the dedicated compliance armies necessary to navigate the regulatory labyrinth. The rules, while ostensibly serving goals like sustainability or safety, were so complex and rapidly changing that they functioned primarily to favor massive, multinational conglomerates who could absorb the compliance costs as a fraction of their operating budget. They weaponized administrative law to exclude competition.
So he was being regulated out of business?
Completely. Julian eventually faced a simple choice: sell his family's legacy to a large private equity firm, a firm that had the dedicated in-house legal team to navigate the regulatory maze or face financial ruin from mounting fines and litigation risk. He was squeezed out not by market competition, but by the sheer cost of regulation.
And that's the soft enclosure.
That's the definition of soft enclosure. Freedom isn't taken away with tanks, but slowly eroded by regulatory sand. Julian wasn't just a victim of bad luck. He was functionally converted from a sovereign business owner into a mere tenant of a global corporate estate. His fate was determined by non-elected technocrats, not by voters or market forces.
So the barrier to entry isn't capital or invention anymore, it's the ability to fund a regulatory compliance department. This concept of feudal regression, where we are being enclosed by regulation, gets accelerated when we introduce digital infrastructure, which leads us directly to techno-feudalism.
This is the argument of economist Yanis Varoufakis. He claims we haven't simply transitioned to a new phase of capitalism. He argues traditional capitalism has collapsed entirely, moving into a structure dominated by a new elite, the cloudalists.
Cloudalists. So how does this differ fundamentally from old school capitalism?
The shift is in the nature of value extraction. Traditional capitalism focused on profit, derived from owning capital factories, machinery, and exploiting labor to maximize that profit through market competition. Techno-feudalism, by contrast, focuses on rent extraction.
Rent, not profit.
Right. Ownership of physical capital is supplanted by rental fees for access to cloud infrastructures, trading platforms, and digital marketplaces. Authority is now held by those who manage these information networks and control the flow of data. The cloudalists, they own the land, but the land is digital. They charge rent for access.
So when I use a social media platform or an online trading venue, I am not just a consumer. I am renting space on their digital fiefdom.
Exactly. And unlike traditional markets, Varoufakis argues this system is characterized by a relentless drive for market dominance through monopolistic strategies rather than competitive profit extraction. The wealth comes from being the sole indispensable platform, allowing you to dictate terms and extract rent.
And what does this make the vast majority of us who operate on these platforms?
We are reduced to a form of digital serfdom. We are working, often unpaid, every time we interact with the platform. Every time you tag a photo, categorize an image like a post, or generate content, you are creating what Varoufakis calls cloud capital.
Our data is their capital.
Precisely. This data, this unpaid labor, is fed back into the platform's algorithms, constantly refining the AI and improving the platform's rental value, enriching the cloudalist ruling class. Under traditional feudalism, the lord owned the land and the serf was bound to it, providing labor in kind. Under techno-feudalism, the cloudalists own the digital infrastructure, and the digital serf is bound to the platform, providing data and content unpaid labor that is converted into the ruling class's core asset. We trade our attention and our data for free access, cementing our role in their extractive economy.
Wow. We've established the state was hijacked by the managerial class through regulatory compliance, and now the entire economic structure is being dominated by cloudalists extracting digital rent. But the most unsettling element of the opening anecdote was the physical displacement of the state's kinetic power, the private drones and security forces. This is the ultimate erosion of the Westphalian contract.
This takes us to the third and, I think, the most existential threat to the nation-state. The erosion of the Westphalian state's core criterion, the monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force. This power is migrating to corporate actors, leading to a system of private kinetic hegemony.
What assets are these corporate actors acquiring that were once the exclusive domain of the nation-state?
We are talking about critical technological asymmetries. These firms now possess sophisticated, often autonomous drone technology capable of high-resolution surveillance and kinetic action. Crucially, they own private satellite networks, orbital assets that provide independent global positioning, communication, and reconnaissance, completely bypassing state-owned infrastructure.
And cyber warfare.
And of course, they possess advanced cyber warfare capabilities, which are a form of non-physical kinetic power that can disable critical infrastructure instantly. In many technical domains, the capabilities of these globally integrated corporate entities often surpass the technological sophistication and deployment speed of the local or even national governments they operate within.
The anecdote about the logistics firm in Zurich demonstrated that at a high global level. But how does this play out on the ground, displacing the function of the local police?
Well, consider the story of Sarah, living in a neighborhood near a major North American tech hub. Her local government was financially stressed, and the police department was underfunded, slow to respond, and facing operational restrictions. The neighborhood, concerned about rising property crime, opted to outsource its fundamental duty of protection.
So they hired private security.
Her homeowners association signed a contract with a private security firm. Let's call them Vanguard Sentry, which happened to be a subsidiary of a major Silicon Valley conglomerate. This firm didn't deploy rent-a-cops. They deployed a comprehensive technological security infrastructure.
So what happened?
One evening, Sarah witnessed a situation unfold. A trespasser entered the private grounds. It wasn't a police cruiser that responded. It was a small, high-definition drone, guided by autonomous AI that rapidly determined the threat level and directed ground units.
So the state had functionally outsourced its most sacred duty protection to a private entity that answered not to the voters or a democratic chain of command, but to a board of directors maximizing shareholder return.
That's the displacement in action. The private entity held the kinetic advantage, the technological edge, and the responsive operational control. The fundamental bargain of the state, we give up the right to use force ourselves in exchange for state protection, is broken. When safety becomes a security-as-a-service subscription, the individual's allegiance shifts pragmatically from the abstract nation-state to the concrete provider of order.
To the neo-feudal lord who keeps the lights on and the criminals out?
Yes, and this is a profound shift. The citizen is replaced by a user in the eyes of the provider, and the most unsettling implication is that a user can be deplatformed. Your physical security, your ability to access protected space can be revoked instantly and without due process based on a terms of service violation, a system audit, or simply a non-payment of the subscription fee. You become digitally exiled from physical safety.
And what does that do to the viability of any kind of traditional political resistance?
It renders it almost entirely obsolete. The functionalist analysis confirms that individual armed resistance, or even traditional civil disobedience, holds almost zero bargaining power against intelligence-driven kinetic systems. You cannot meaningfully contest a network of autonomous drones, AI surveillance grids, and orbital assets with traditional decentralized means.
The asymmetry of force is just too great.
It's overwhelming. The state is effectively demoted because its primary purpose, the provision of security, is being performed more efficiently, if terrifyingly, by the private sector.
This erosion of physical order, combined with the regulatory complexity we discussed, seems to create a political vacuum filled by chaos and arbitrary rule. This is where we introduce Samuel Francis's concept of anarcho-tyranny.
Francis coined this term to describe a state operating in two contradictory modes simultaneously. On one hand, you have anarchy. Laws protecting ordinary law-abiding citizens against common criminals or property crime are simply not enforced. The state fails in its primary traditional duties to maintain public order and safety.
And on the other hand, you have the tyranny.
The tyranny occurs concurrently. Government elites focus intensely on harassing, regulating, and policing law-abiding citizens through excessive bureaucracy and ideological enforcement. The law is focused on busybodying, about behavior that does not derive from any shared moral consensus, while genuine public safety breaks down.
So it's fundamentally law without order. The state has become preoccupied with abstract ideological goals, neglecting the core physical function of keeping people safe and property secure.
It creates a climate of fear and profound resentment. The state's apparatus is fully functional. It can track, regulate, and fine you for a minor permitting issue, but when you actually need its core protection, it is functionally absent. This condition is deeply destabilizing because it attacks the legitimacy of the rule of law itself. If the system only enforces rules arbitrarily and only harasses those who are easy targets, the compliant, while ignoring serious persistent threats to life and property, it proves itself incompatible with traditional democratic governance.
We've covered kinetic displacement and regulatory and anarchic chaos. The final pillar the managerial system is attacking is cognitive power, the ability to define reality itself. This is the domain of cognitive capture and anomie.
This is often referred to as cognitive Bolshevization. The technical managerial apparatus systematically strips individuals of their moral and epistemic agency. The discourse is deliberately channeled into the language of data, metrics, efficiency, and optimization. This technical language inherently sidelines moral reasoning, historical context, and traditional human judgment.
Right, it's the ultimate technocratic move, reframing every single societal debate as a systems optimization problem that only the experts can solve.
Exactly. And when you do that, citizens are effectively reduced to programmable data assets whose behavior must be predicted and shaped for optimal systemic performance. Political or moral disagreements are no longer viewed as legitimate differences in worldview. They are framed as system errors, misinformation, or extremism that must be corrected by algorithmic governance and editorial fiat.
Your individual moral reasoning is outsourced to an automated system.
It is. And this outsourcing, this collapse of a shared moral and epistemic framework, must lead to widespread social normlessness. It leads to profound social anomie because the shared legal, moral, and epistemological basis needed for collaboration evaporates. Furthermore, this dynamic leads to sovereign fragmentation. When you have multiple, massive, competing corporate sovereignties, each with its own constantly changing terms of service, its own platform rules, its own internal definitions of truth, and its own algorithmic enforcement mechanisms, it destroys the foundational shared legal structure necessary for complex societal collaboration.
So if everyone is playing by different, constantly shifting rules, you can't get anything done.
The transaction costs soar. Innovation stalls as energy is diverted solely to navigating these conflicting jurisdictional claims and constantly protecting against the risk of arbitrary deplatforming, which can amount to total digital and economic exile. It's civilizational entropy, masked by the slickest technology money can buy.
This systemic move toward disorder, this spiraling inefficiency created by layers of competing bureaucracy, suggests that the managerial system is not just unfair, but inherently unstable. This leads us to the theoretical underpinning of societal collapse articulated by Joseph Tainter.
Tainter's work focused on the inevitable decay caused by the diminishing marginal returns on complexity, ROC. His theory is critical because it argues society's collapse not necessarily due to resource depletion alone, but due to internal structural failures related to overinvestment in complex bureaucracy.
Okay, lay out the core premise for us. How does complexity destroy a society?
Tainter showed that complexity measured as administrative size, specialization, and hierarchical differentiation increases whenever a society faces a systemic problem, especially a shock to energy or resource availability. For instance, if you face a food shortage, you create a Ministry of Agriculture, you invest in new irrigation complexity, and you add layers of inspectors.
You add bureaucracy to solve the problem.
Right. And for a while, these investments work, boosting output and solving the immediate problem. However, they follow the economic law of diminishing returns. Each new layer of bureaucracy and specialization solves smaller and smaller problems at a higher and higher cost. They eventually reach a tipping point where the associated costs, the calories, the time, the material resources required just to maintain the administrative structure begin to outweigh the benefits derived from the new layer of complexity.
So we create an energy complexity spiral. We spend more and more energy just to run the system, but the system produces less and less resilience.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The system becomes brittle, losing its resilience because its costs continue to rise faster than its useful returns. Once the low-hanging fruit of complexity are picked, the society is locked into a costly, hyper-specialized structure, driving it toward collapse because it can no longer afford to fix the next major problem when it arises.
And we have a dynamic agent-based network model that abstractly illustrates this problem by modeling laborers versus administrators. So how did that simulation show this inescapable spiral?
The model abstracted society into productive laborers who generate energy and administrators who do not produce energy but increase the productivity of the laborers they are connected to through coordination. Societal complexity is simply measured by the size of the administration.
Okay.
The model was designed to reflect historical reality. When the society faced a crisis, energy production dropped below a required threshold. The system's only mechanism for solving the problem was to appoint a new administrator, increasing complexity. Initially, these new administrators boosted energy production significantly because they coordinated many laborers.
But the key structural failure was the marginal return.
Exactly. As the administrative share of the population grew, the marginal return on complexity became increasingly small and then critically negative. The cost of maintaining the new administrator in terms of the resources he consumed and the inefficiency he introduced was greater than the increase in productivity he generated. The increase in administrators eventually caused the net energy production to decline towards zero, leading to systemic collapse.
The dreaded ratchet effect.
Yes, the simulation reflects Tainter's historical observation. Societies primarily know how to add complexity, but rarely how to subtract it.
But the model offered a fascinating theoretical escape hatch from that doom loop, the vital role of social mobility. What did the data on mobility reveal?
When the model was first constructed, it had a hardwired ratchet. Once an administrator, always an administrator. This guaranteed collapse. However, when the researchers introduced a simple mechanism for social mobility, the results changed dramatically. They allowed agents to randomly change their status. An administrator might revert to a laborer, or a laborer might be promoted to administration at a fixed small probability.
A bit of churn in the system.
Just a bit. The analysis found that if you allow just one person per time step to shift status, say a bureaucrat is fired and must become a laborer, or a laborer is promoted to administration, that modest amount of healthy churn is enough to stabilize the entire system and mitigate collapse entirely, allowing for theoretically infinite survival time.
So, preventing the administrative body from becoming permanently entrenched through consistent turnover and meritocratic movement is the system's self-correcting mechanism.
It acts as an internal regulator of complexity. When the returns on complexity become negative, the social mobility mechanism slowly reduces the administrative share simply by chance and necessity, preventing the administrative swamp from growing to the point of systemic failure. The finding underscores that even more than high productivity or network density, the ability to regulate complexity through dynamic social mobility is the dominant factor for long-term civilizational survival. A rigid, entrenched managerial class is literally an engine of collapse.
That structural rigidity connects perfectly back to the final observation about systemic decay, the institutional and cultural loss of knowledge due to the entrenchment of this unproductive managerial class, the process known as civilizational alopecia.
Civilizational alopecia refers to the shedding of critical, functional cognitive capital, and it's caused by the undermining of meritocratic principles. The managerial class, focused on cognitive capture and narrative control, prioritizes ideology over practical expertise. When merit is replaced by compliance with abstract metrics, the society collectively forgets how to run its own complex systems.
And we see this most clearly in the account of Marcus, the power grid engineer. Tell us about the systemic decay he observed.
Marcus was a third-generation power grid engineer, having spent 30 years maintaining a major city's increasingly aging physical infrastructure. His account detailed the systemic decay not just of the copper wiring, but of the culture required to maintain it. He described how his department's traditional meritocratic leadership, the people who had worked their way up, understood stress tolerances, and knew how to fix a failing transformer with specialized tools, was systematically replaced.
And in their place.
In came the technocratic managerial class. These new leaders were experts in abstraction. They focused on cognitive capture, implementing diversity metrics, and optimizing data assets. They were managers of narratives and compliance, utterly disconnected from the physical reality of his substation. Marcus recounted that they could generate a beautiful report showing optimized power delivery metrics, but they couldn't distinguish a high-voltage conduit from a garden hose.
So, when a major piece of infrastructure actually failed, what was the priority of the new managerial class?
When a major substation failed, leading to a widespread outage, Marcus and his team knew exactly the engineering flaw. But the new managers didn't focus on the engineering. Their priority was immediately shifted to managing the public's perception of the failure. They treated the citizens' frustration as programmable data that needed to be neutralized with carefully crafted messaging, rather than treating the fault as an engineering problem that needed deep, practical expertise.
Wow.
Marcus's account highlights a terrifying disconnect. This displacement of deep, meritocratic experts by a managerial class focused on optics and abstract metrics. Burnham's administrative engineers replacing the specialized technicians is a primary mechanism of systemic decay. As complexity rises, the practical competence required to maintain the complexity is being purged. The society loses the ability to maintain its own highly complex machinery, accelerating the collapse trajectory predicted by Tainter's model, ushering in an era of functionalist anomie where nobody is truly capable of doing the necessary work.
So what does this all mean for us? We started with the state defining sovereignty through coercion and capital, and we've ended with the quiet dismantling of that structure by non-elected forces wielding two new dominant tools: digital compliance and private kinetic power. The trajectory isn't forward progress, it's a dangerous regression toward neo-feudal arrangements, where sovereignty is owned by platforms and power is held by the non-accountable managerial class.
The conclusion is stark. If collective democratic control over the fundamental levers of violence and currency is not reasserted, if the state continues to allow its core sovereignty to be outsourced and managed by the cloudalists and the managerial elite, then all the technological and social advancements we see will merely serve as ornate decoration on the road to a digital serfdom. The choice facing us is whether we remain sovereign citizens or accept becoming subjects of the new, non-elected lords.
For those who can see this displacement happening in real time, the strategy must shift dramatically away from romantic revolt or minor political tweaks. The scale of the managerial and technological capture demands a corresponding response. The deliberate construction of resilient, parallel institutions focused on preserving knowledge, practical skills, and robust social bonds outside the dominant managerial matrix. It means preparing for a long period of civilizational winter where we must safeguard the cognitive and practical capital necessary for whatever comes next.